Here is a purple ink by Sailor, Studio 653. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook. A beautiful darker purple that can come across as very dark and almost black, depending on the pen and paper that you choose to use. So yes, there is a ton of tone variation by pen, and the shading may be present depending on the pen you choose. So it is both a decent shading purple and an almost blackish purple, giving the best of both experience. So here, the Sailor Studio put out a real winner for me. But I expect that there's going to be a bunch of people feeling that it's just too dark for them. The pen for today is a Parker J.R.R. All of the writing samples are done with a Retro 51 P51 with an extra fine nib, a Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there, starting with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the extra fine nib, we do have a darker purple. It's not super dark. This is the lightest tone that we're going to get. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We do get some very nice shading. Look at themselves before on the second line, where the TH is very dark. The E lightens up some, lightening even more into the M, SE. The L starts to get darker again. The V lightens up, and the ES start getting very dark, where B4 starts as a nice mid for what this is giving, lightening up into the E, nice mid again on the F, lightening on the OR, very dark at the E. Looking at the medium nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the extra fine. There is no feather, there is no spread, there is some shading, but not tons. If you look at only made 13, to be able to see some of the shading, in only it starts lighter on the on, and the LY do get darker, where made is a lighter M, darker aid at the end. 13 starts very dark. It's the IR that lighten up, but the teen stays very dark because we know teens are dark anyway. Looking at the stub nib, it is just a little bit darker than it was with the medium. There is no feathering, there is no spread. I think the shading here is much better than we had with the medium. Look at and other things on the third line, where and starts light, works its way until the D, where it gets very dark. Other starts light on the O, very dark on the T, but lightens up out of the T into the H, where the up and down stroke of the H is dark, but the hump is not. The ER, much darker again. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 7 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Looking at the extra fine nib, it is just as dark as it was with the Clairfontaine, not any darker, really the same tone with no feather and no spread. Some decent shading stumbled across when we look at stumbled on the third line, where the STU are a little bit darker than the M, but the BLED at the end do get quite a bit darker, and we get to see a bunch of shading like this happen across what's going on, yet not really with the word across right next to it, which is mostly one solid lighter tone. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine, We get no feathering and we get no spread. We get very little shading over here. When we look at over on the second line, I'm assuming you can hear the motorcycles going by. Over starts lighter, gets very dark at the R. Now that's pretty much where we do see some of the shading. Otherwise, what we get is what happens at what? Right next to that, where the W is a little bit lighter than the hat at the end. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We do get better shading than we had on the medium, though not as good as we were getting on the Clairfontaine. Look at curled on the first line, where the C is darker than the UR. The L is very dark. The E and beginning of the D are just a little bit lighter than the up and down stroke of the D ending. Even asleep underneath it, the AS is only slightly lighter than the leap that ends. Looking at the back of the page, we see the ghosting is really under control. There's almost none. I see it in person. I don't think it's coming through on camera. I still think you could write on the back of this page without any kind of a problem. There was no bleed through touching the page underneath.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine, darker than it was with any of the nibs on the Clairfontaine. We're getting an almost black, but looks kind of not, but kind of black look of it. That's why I say sometimes it can be almost black. There's no feathering, there's no spread, there's no shading. It's a very interesting color because, again, it's almost black, but something not quite black about it, which makes it very nice to look at on this paper. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get no shading, we get a very interesting, not quite black, certainly super dark purple about it, and it still looks so good. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. Here we do get a couple of moments where maybe there's a little shading showing through, like can't on the first line. The CA are a darker midtone. The N lightens just a little bit, where the T is definitely darker than any of the other letters. But for the most part, that's all the shading that I can see here. Really, it comes across a very dark, very solid most all the time. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left. Pen flush is on the top right. 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left. And water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. We do get to see some shading in the sleep and find on the second line, where the SL are a little bit darker than the EE, and the P does darken up a little bit, and starts just slightly lighter on the AN, where the D does get a little bit darker. Find is mostly a dark word. It's the N that just does lighten up a little bit. Mostly what we're getting here is a lot of the darker tones, not a ton of shading, but you can definitely spot it. And I'm saying not a ton because the change is very subtle in the shading. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a little bit darker than it was with the extra fine. The same tone as the Clairfontaine, with no feathering, with no spread, with shading that I think is coming through a little bit better than it did on the Clairfontaine. Now, forest, the first word on the first line, is very dark, but must underneath it, the M is a little bit lighter than the ust at the end. But when we been getting decent shading on the majority, here look at been getting second line, where the B and the N are darker than both the E's, and the N is not even as dark as the B. Very interesting. Now, getting, the top of the G is much lighter than the bottom of the G, and the E is very dark, where the first T, nice mid-tone, second T, very dark into the I. N is a mid-tone, top of the G is a mid-tone, bottom of the G is very dark. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. There's a regular amount of shading that's going on here, just like there was on the Clairfontaine. Look at there's a regular, first line, where the TH is darker than the E. Now it lightens up again into the R, darkens just a little bit into the E, darkens a little bit more into the S. A, one letter, one tone, lighter tone. Regular starts light on the R. The E gets very dark. The G lightens up a little bit into the U. Now, during the U, it transitions from a lighter to darker tone, which it holds through the L, and it lightens just a hair into the AR at the end. Looking at the back of the page, with no surprise, there's no bleeding, no ghosting. Always great performance on Rhodia.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Diamine Bilberry. Here is KWZ Berry. Here is Noodler's North African Violet. Here is Robert Oster Viola. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It comes across with no bleeding, no feathering, wrong side of the paper, no spread, almost nothing for shading. There are a few darker letters that we can point out, but in the end, I think the key here is this is very nice on this paper. Again, it's not fountain pen friendly paper, but it tends to do so well that that's why I keep using it and will keep using it for a long time. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we do get some shading, very nice, much better shading here than we had on the Clairfontaine. Get help if you can't see it. Look at get help on the second line, where the top of the G is lighter than the bottom of the G. It lightens up into the E, and the T and that downstroke, very dark. Help starts very dark on the he, slightly lighter on the L, very dark on the P. It's not a result of an accident. It's a result of something they did on purpose, I think. Look at result on the third line, where the RESU are lighter than the L, which is a nice midtone, and the T becomes very dark. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, though I would not call this a light ink at all here. No feather, no spread, really magnificent shading. Look at magnificent on the first line. Thank you for having that word come up at this time. The MA are lighter than the G. Now, the G is lighter at the top and darker at the bottom. The NI do lighten up, but the FI do darken some more. The CEN lighter and the T much darker. And it does this a lot, not just that word, but all over the place, really making this from a stub on this paper. If you're a student and you're doing this, go for the stub because, man, you're about to get a grade bump just for doing that. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting, making this really a great ink for students all around.
While it's nice to see inks in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements this color on the page. Here is a green ink by Graf von Faber-Castell Moss Green. Here is a gray ink by Graf von Faber-Castell Stone Gray. Here is a pink ink by Graf von Faber-Castell Electric Pink. Here is a yellow ink by Robert Oster Honeybee. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We do get a little bit of feathering, go figure. We do get a little bit of spread, go figure. We don't get any shading really at all, go figure. It is 20-pound copy paper after all. Looking at the medium nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the extra fine, bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. Yes, we have feathering. Yes, we have spread. No, we don't have shading. No, I don't like this. The feathering and the spread here are not something that I would want to live with. It's not something I would want to see on any regular basis. I'm not harping on how bad it is, but look at harping on the second line. The feathering and the spread are just... ew. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. Yes, we get feathering. Yes, we get spread. No, we don't get any shading. This is not a flowery good ink in how it's working here. If you had to do it, I'm sorry, you should use a different ink because you're really missing out on a great ink using it on this paper. Please stop confusing toilet paper and copy paper. Don't wipe with this paper. It would probably be really rough. Looking at the back of the 20-pound toilet paper, we get the ink is very deep into the paper. You can't write back here, but nothing bled through touching the page underneath, meaning at least it has that going for it.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
From the dry extra fine, it gives a beautiful mid-tone purple with a nice seasoning of shading throughout. The medium is much darker, and the shading, when you can find it, is just beautiful. The stub is largely the same tone as the medium, but it does give shading. In fact, the best shading of those nibs. Now, it would seem that the stub with the best shading is what I would go for, but it's not. It was the tone from the... It was the tone with the light peppering of shading from the dry extra fine that to me looked the best on the page. So that's why I would recommend a dry extra fine or fine pen here.
I hope you got something out of this video, and I want to remind you that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you've heard of something if you were to go to buy.